All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to Tarragona, to all the ones from you that are coming from somewhere else in Spain or somewhere else from another part of the world. My name is Mònica Pons. I'm here in name on the behalf of my colleagues of the organizing committee of the TIEC. So we just would like to thank you all for participating. Thank you all for coming here today. Thank you for being here at the 8th TIEC colloquium. This year, TIEC is about the legal insights to combat the biodiversity crisis. So we hope we are going to have a nice discussion. We aim to reflect on the role of law and legal systems in ensuring the preservation of the biodiversity, but also we would like to discuss the challenges that we might encounter to achieve this ecocentric or biocentric perspective through law. The TIEC colloquium is jointly organized by the Tarragona Center for Environmental Law Studies, the CEDAT, and the Tarragona Environmental Law Studies Association, the AAEDAT, with I'm a member of both, as the rest of my colleagues, and within the Department of Public Law at the University Rovira, Virgili. First of all, we would like to thank you, the university. We would like to thank you, the Studies Council, the AGAUR, the CEDAT, and the rest of the entities that have contributed to the successful of the organization and bringing this colloquium into life. So also we would like to give a special thanks to Mercè Figueras, who has supported us administratively through the organization process. And we are honored to have Dr. Iyan Offor, who is a lecturer in law at Birmingham City University, Dr. Maria Marquez Banqué, who is an associate professor of criminal law and a researcher at the Tarragona Center for Environmental Law Studies at the CEDAT, and Dr. Avi Brisman, who is a professor, in the School of Justice Studies at Eastern Kentucky University. So thank you all for the participation and thank you all for agreeing to be a keynote in this year's colloquium. We would also like to thank you, the scientific committee, Marcos de Armenteras, Alison Hutchinson, and Teresa Fajardo, for their time and their insights when reviewing the received abstracts. Of course, we would also like to thank all the attendees and participants who are joining us, either online and in person, and express a deep satisfaction for sharing your knowledge with us, your thoughts and your views in this biodiversity topic. As we shall see, we are at a very important moment, and it's likely to mark a turning point in life, in all forms of life in the near future, but Teresa is going to talk about this thoroughly. So we highly encourage you to engage in the colloquium, to ask questions and to have an active participation while we are going through the different panels and activities in this next couple of days. We would like to put on record that with this Congress, we try to organize it from a gender, decolonial and sustainable perspective. So we've tried, without departing from quality criteria, to ensure that diverse gender voices, voices from the global north and the global south were included. And as it is an environmental law Congress, we've tried to be consistent with principles of sustainability. So we ensured that the catering was local, that the products were sustainable, and we offer only vegetarian food during the conference. Regarding to the structure of each panel, the keynote speakers will have 40 minutes each to present their topic, and then we will follow it by 10-12 minutes presentation each person during the panel. And then we are going to use the last minutes for a Q&A session where you can just engage in a discussion with the keynotes or the participants. So those that are attending the colloquium via Teams, please, we kindly ask you to keep your microphones and cameras off while you are not speaking. The ones that are attending online can make questions through the question and answer feature. And one member of the organizing committee is going to keep track of these questions. So we are going to raise them at the end of the session, in which you are going to be able to turn off your microphones and the camera if you want to make it in person, if you prefer not to be said by us or not to write them down. We also like to inform you that we encourage you to submit a paper of your presentation in the Revista Catalana de Dret Ambiental. But if you have more questions about that, please feel free to ask any of the ones that are organizing the committee, and we are going to give you more information. If not, we have Gaston here, so he can explain everything about the Revista Catalana de Dret Ambiental. Without further delay, I now give the floor to my friend and colleague, Dr. Teresa Fajardo. She's a professor in the area of international environmental law, a member of the CEDAT, and also a member of the TIEC Scientific Committee. So thank you very much for being here today and for joining us, for all your help. And Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mònica. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I just said hello to Victor, who entered. Being here is like being part of a community, an epistemic community and a family dedicated madly, passionately to the study of environmental law in the different, with the different possibilities, because when the Professor Tony Pigrau founded the CEDAT, the Center for the Study of the Environment, his purpose was to approach it with a multidisciplinary approach and focusing on the question that could have an impact in communities. And as a public service, how can the university can help students, professionals, law enforcement agents. So for me, it's always a privilege to be here. And I was thinking about Professor Maria Marquez that started the clinical studies at the University of Tarragona, becoming one of these very important references in Spain when we think about the application of environmental law by universities, but at the same time assessing the autonomous community, the Generalitat, and making a very important impact in the practical studies. So when they trusted me with the first colloquium 8 years ago, with being part of the scientific committee, it was a great pleasure. And again, it's a great pleasure to be here when we are going to discuss about biodiversity. All of you are committed with the protection of biodiversity, the fight against biodiversity loss in different ways. For me, it's a very important subject from an academic point of view. Of course, I've been working with it for a long period of time. I teach in the environmental science studies in my faculty of science back in Granada, and my students have shown me the main challenges and the main gaps that require our attention. So when I started working with biodiversity protection, it's for sure that I did it keeping in mind all these big challenges that came from science, not just law or international law. So it's great to have the opportunity to exchange ideas with you, because I know that you share this multidisciplinary approach in order to study environmental problems and environmental issues. And this is a very important moment, because just the past December, the COP15 of the Framework Convention on Biodiversity took place after a very difficult time, because for almost 2 years, China, that was going to be the leader in this Conference of the Parties of the Framework Convention on Biodiversity, had to postpone because of the outbreak of COVID that made totally impossible to celebrate this COP in Kunming in China. After these 2 years, the Conference of the Parties took place in Montreal. And in this occasion, we are thinking about a big conference of the parties that had to be postponed for 2 years. That meant that head of states and presidents had previously met in the General Assembly that have committed with the biodiversity protection through pledges. And then the first meeting in Kunming was a very important moment in which China started to present a new narrative for the protection of biodiversity that has a very important political and legal approach to the way biodiversity is protected or is going to be protected by the global south, and the position that the developed countries are going to adopt, reacting to this new narrative started by China, talking about the ecological civilization. So I think that when the Conference of the Parties finally gathered in Montreal, and the new goals and targets for the protection of biodiversity were adopted, and the new strategy for the post-2020 was adopted, it was a moment, a very important moment for the protection of biodiversity. And we are going to discuss about the most important issues that were discussed and adopted in Montreal. You know that after this Conference of the Parties, we have new targets that are replacing the Aichi targets that were important to establish the biodiversity expectations for states, stakeholders, NGOs, but somehow, even though these targets were important to show the path for the biodiversity protection, the truth is the outcomes were insufficient. And this is something that has been discussed for the past years as one of the main priorities. International environmental law and environmental law, they have a problem. In particular, the problem of the deficit of implementation and compliance. And it's a deficit that we can find at the local level, at the regional level, at the state level, and at the international level. How can we deal with this deficit of implementation and compliance? This was discussed in this Conference of the Parties in order to change things. And one of the main issues that were discussed was the opportunity to change the approach to the way the goals were going to be pursued by states. And many of you are going to discuss about these national plans implementing the biodiversity targets and the new strategy for the post-2020 period. So how can we achieve better results? How can we deal with this need of better and enhanced implementation of biodiversity targets? Again, this is the main challenge. How can we improve without forcing developing countries, developing countries are already saying that this is a new form of eco-colonialism, and we have to hear them, and we have to hear what they are saying to us about the way we are going to help them to implement these targets, taking into account their national circumstances. And this is something that you are going to discuss during this seminar, and I'm sure that all of us, we are going to learn together when trying to answer all these new questions and all these new challenges that somehow come from the past and come from the past failures that we are going to try to solve. So it will be my pleasure to be part of this seminar during these 2 days, and I welcome you as pollinators of knowledge. So the title was perfect. Don't kill the bee, but at the same time the European Union, and we are going to discuss this, is discussing the adoption of a regulation on restoration, and it's going to be very important. It's going to be called Law on Restoration. It's a regulation, but it tastes as a directive. It might be a little bit disappointed, but it has an Article 8 to protect pollinators. So we are going to be pollinators of knowledge, and we are going to work and we are going to transmit our ideas about the protection of biodiversity after this seminar. And so I welcome you and thank you for coming here and to have this opportunity of working all together in this very important subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That was lovely and very insightful. I give the floor to my colleague and friend, Marouane Laabbas, and he's going to chair the first panel of this conference. I hope you all enjoy it, in which we are going to discuss the diagnosis of the biodiversity crisis. And please, we are going to start with Dr. Iyan Offor. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. And well, it is a pleasure to me to present the first panel today, which is entitled Diagnosis of the Current Biodiversity Crisis. And we just started and we're already 17 minutes late. So I go a bit fast in order to do not lose more time. The first keynote speaker is Professor Iyan Offor, who joined us, and I thank him a lot for being here with us. He is a lecturer, as Mònica just said, at Birmingham City University, and where he teaches environmental law and legal theory. Professor Offor conducts interdisciplinary, socio-legal, and theoretical research, focusing on global animal law, environmental justice, intersectionality, post-humanism, and law in the Anthropocene. Professor Offor will publish his first monograph, hopefully next month, entitled Global Animal Law from the Margins. And today we will attend his speech, which is entitled Multispecies Lawscapes in the Anthropocene, Priorities for a Critical Constitutional Turn in Biodiversity Law. And regarding the tight schedule that we have today, I just give the floor to Professor Offor. So, Iyan, if I may, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So, I'll be as quick as I can. Good morning, everyone. This is working? Yes. Thank you. Is that better? Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to see all of you here, some old friends and some new ones for me today. Thank you so much to the organizers for bringing together this community. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about all of your really fascinating and important work. I have to start by saying when I received this invitation to present one of the keynote speeches at Tarragona, my first thought was, no, they've made a mistake. I don't think they meant to ask me. I see the prolific and incredible work of the keynote speakers who've come here to Tarragona before this year, and I didn't see myself sitting amongst them. So I thought really hard about what I could contribute to this community today, especially finding out I'm opening the conference, so there's no pressure. But I like that we've talked about being pollinators of knowledge already, because this actually perfectly aligns with what I was hoping to contribute in my talk today. I don't know that I feel qualified to diagnose the biodiversity crisis. It's so broad, so pressing, and so multidisciplinary, as has been said. What I think I can do, coming from my background as a global animal law and global environmental law scholar, what I think I can do is set the scene for us in a multi-species kind of way for our conversations over the next 2 days. In all of my work, I try to bring animals into the conversation and think about tools as to how we can bring non-human animals and nature, broadly speaking, into the work that we're doing and the conversations that we're having. So what I would like to do with you this morning is set the scene and perhaps diagnose some current crises in the scholarship that we're working with, the international environmental law scholarship, and to diagnose or investigate those crises from a multi-species or post-human perspective. So decentering our human perspectives on these issues. So in my talk, I'll present some research that I've done with a colleague of mine who many of you are likely to know, Dr. Antonio Cardessa-Salzman, who's fantastic. He's one of my favorite people. One of the reasons why I was motivated to come to Tarragona. Working with him, we've produced some work on responding to biodiversity and other crises in the Anthropocene. And Antonio has focused on societal boundaries as a concept, how we can address societal imbalances in terms of social justice, post-colonial or decolonial justice as well. And we've had many conversations because I've been thinking about this, an idea of multi-species boundaries, about responding to interspecies relations and injustice to non-humans, and how we could incorporate those boundaries or interests into the work that we're doing. So what I would like to do in my presentation is set out some of the issues as I see them and some of the opportunities with the scholarship and where we're at today, particularly in the context of the Anthropocene, and then tell you a little bit about my idea to think in a sense of multi-species boundaries, incorporating the interests and boundaries of non-human species. I'm particularly motivated in this regard because I find that environmental law, very broadly speaking, often treats individual animals as, and I'll borrow a term from Carol J. Adams here, a very prominent feminist animal scholar, animal studies scholar. She talks about how animals are often treated as absent referents in society. They're referred to, we see them in the conversations we're having, but somehow they're still absent. And I see that very commonly in environmental law, where we talk about nature broadly conceived, we talk about doing better for the environment, environmental justice, and so on. But often the individual experience of non-human animals and others are lost in that broad conversation. So I'm interested in doing some work to try and correct the way in which animals have been treated as absent reference within environmental law scholarship. And of course, that's a very broad and perhaps bold statement. Not all environmental law scholarship does this, but on the whole, I do see this issue come up again and again, where animals are made invisible in this scholarship. We feel that if we are to respond to our biodiversity crisis, other environmental crises, and the issues of the Anthropocene as a whole, if we are to respond to these and get through the Anthropocene in vaguely good shape, we need to look to these multi-species kinds of approaches. We need to look beyond the human in the work that we're doing. So that's what I'm hoping to do today. I'll present this work to you in 3 parts. I'll start off pretty easily with some concepts that we're probably all familiar with. I'll talk about the Anthropocene, its related planetary boundaries, and also this idea of planetary justice. And I'll talk about how non-human animals can be seen within these concepts or integrated into them if they're not there already. Second, I'll move on to talk about our relatively cursory investigation of the literature to identify and spot trends within critical environmental law scholarship, globally speaking, and how these could point to potentially crises, but also opportunities in thinking in a multi-species kind of way. And then lastly, I'll give you some insights into the sorts of tools that I think we could use to do more multi-species kinds of work. And that's what I'm hoping will be informative for the rest of our time here in Tarragona, for those of us who are visiting, over the next couple of days. I'm hoping that these ideas about noticing what boundaries animals might choose for themselves and responding to them, doing something when we notice those boundaries, I'm hoping we can use that to inspire the kinds of limits we place on the work that we do, that we'll be talking about. Entirely forgot there was a slideshow presentation happening, so we can move that forward. Thank you. One more. So that's our structure. And one more. All right, so let's start with the Anthropocene, something that we're probably all fairly familiar with at this point in time. The Anthropocene, as many of you will know, is the new geological epoch in which we find ourselves, following on from the Holocene. And it's an epoch in which humankind's actions have become the dominant impact on our climate and our environment, broadly speaking. From a multi-species perspective, a perspective that looks beyond the human gaze, the human lens, I think it's apt and important to question the anthropocentricity of the Anthropocene concept. We're again and again centering humans, their activities and their responses and evolutions in the concepts that we're thinking with. And I'm not the only person to point out this fact about the Anthropocene, far from it. Donna Haraway, who is a scholar that I admire greatly, who thinks about these things very deeply, has proposed the Cthulhucene as an alternative to the Anthropocene concept. And for her, instead of focusing on the detrimental impact of human activity for this new age, the Cthulhucene would emphasize forward-looking efforts to make kin, to make close relations and symbiotic family almost, as an environmental community. She sees potential for embracing and enhancing those symbiotic, those mutually beneficial relationships in our laws. So that's just an alternative focus that has been proposed by Donna Haraway. And of course, other terms like the Capitalocene and others have been proposed as well, particularly sometimes to identify the fact that not all human societies have contributed equally to our current crises. The concept of the Anthropocene tends to flatten out those impacts as if all humans contributed equally. But there are concepts available to think with that see that in a slightly more nuanced way. We can move this slide forward if you don't mind. Again, this is probably an image that many of us, if not all of us, are very familiar with, but it felt apt to bring this to your attention to set the tone for the next couple of days. So this new age of the Anthropocene is very heavily linked to this concept, which has been increasingly talked about in international environmental law scholarship, of the planetary boundaries. And what's represented in this image is the planetary boundaries framework. This framework was designed to define a safe operating space for humanity. A space for us to do the things that we do as humans, enterprise, sociality, community building, whatever else. A space to do that which is safe, which allows for our survival and our comfort. So you know what I'm going to say, I'm sure. It's very interesting that, again, at this moment, in trying to think about rectifying the impact of human beings on Earth, we're attaching the Anthropocene to a concept that is defined by the safe operating zone as we see it for humanity, humans alone. This concept has been talked about as quite progressive and forward-thinking in terms of how we respond to environmental crises, including the biodiversity crisis. But it centers humanity's safety and not the safety or comfort of other species, other forms of life. So that is something to think about and bear in mind. You may know that when the Planetary Boundaries Framework was first proposed in 2009, that it was immediately identified that 4 of those planetary boundaries had already been breached. So 4 boundaries that indicate what a safe operating zone for humanity looks like. We had already crossed those thresholds into a space of danger as opposed to safety. And one of those breached boundaries is biosphere integrity. which is defined as the threshold beyond which ecosystems can no longer continue to provide goods and services to human society due to biodiversity loss. So that's the phrasing in the planetary boundaries framework that encompasses biodiversity. That place of safety is a place in which there is no longer enough biodiversity to provide goods and services to humankind. So again, think about that. These are the tools that we're thinking with, the frameworks we're often operating within as international environmental law scholars. So you'll see here, biosphere integrity is at the very top of this diagram. There are two parts to that integrity indicator. One is genetic diversity and extinction rates. That has been breached significantly to the highest degree on the chart. The other part of this indicator is functional diversity. So this is referred to often as biodiversity intactness. We haven't yet even been able to quantify this. If we were to quantify this, it's likely that we already would have breached this boundary as well. So another question that I would pose for you today, I am curious, if we were to imagine a new kind of planetary boundary framework that incorporated not just humankind's safety, but the safety of other species, would we have different kinds of boundaries included? Would we have different indicators to choose whether those boundaries had been breached or not? What would this chart look like if we were to view it from a multi-species perspective? I don't have the answer, but that's something that I encourage you to think about over the next couple of days. So we can move forward in the slide. Thank you. So what now? There's one more concept that I'll talk about before I move on to talk about some of the literature. How should law respond to this evolving situation? And how should we as scholars interested in biodiversity respond and shape our work? In the research that we've done, we've seen a growing trend in more critically oriented scholarship on international environmental law, recommending new kinds of approaches to thinking about environmental protection. Those include post-humanist approaches, which nuance or even erode the human subject, thinking about it in a different kind of way. They include systems-oriented approaches, which we're all probably familiar with, inspired by the interconnectedness of the environment and other systems in society and sociological studies, more broadly speaking. It's possible to think about law in a systems-oriented kind of way. And there's also, of course, more and more work thinking about law in an ecocentric kind of way. But of course, important to point out that a lot of the concepts that we're working with aren't actually ecocentric in nature, even though they talk about and are placed within our natural environment. So I think if we were to genuinely rethink law and to do it differently in a post-humanist, systems-oriented and ecocentric way, I think that would result in a pretty radical reformulation of what law looks like in ontoepistemological terms. I think what we're doing now doesn't come close to those kinds of approaches in any real sense, and I'm sure that will be borne out by the various presentations over the next couple of days, which I'm sure will be critical of a lot of developments in international environmental law. So we're interested in introducing tools to think with, to try and move in this better, more ecocentric and post-humanist direction. And I want to give you some tools to think with today in a multi-species kind of way. More specifically, I suppose we set our goal as moving towards what Kuhn and Jefferson have called an ecocentric, post-humanist legal imaginary. An imaginary, a universe that we can conjure up in our minds that's forward-looking and more ecocentric. We're interested in decentering human actors in scholarship in order to move towards those kinds of legal imaginaries. And often, I think we're shoehorned into thinking that's not the kind of work we should be doing as legal scholars. I don't know about the traditions you were all brought up in as legal scholars, but there's such an emphasis on black letter law, on working with the law we currently have. It's common to feel like we're pushing up against a lot of resistance to try and think in an imaginative, forward-looking kind of way. But of course, it's very important for all of us thinking about the biodiversity crisis that we do feel comfortable doing that. Yes, I think I'm ready to move on. Thank you. So in particular, we're progressing on this front and thinking in a more imaginative way by using the concept of planetary justice, which we find to be quite useful. Planetary justice is defined by Dreisig and Pickering, and they set out some of the key concepts for this new kind of justice, which they think is relevant for lawyers and political scientists in the Anthropocene. We wish to build on some of this core content of planetary justice that they have already identified. So essentially, they expand the idea of justice, which we're familiar with as legal scholars, to include not just human justice. So we're talking about justice to future generations, for example, in conversations around climate change, and to the Earth system as a whole, to non-humans and to nature broadly speaking. They see planetary justice as it says on the slide, overcoming the human-nature divide, recognizing that divide as false. Human beings are incorporated within nature, and we are natural entities in ourselves. So blurring that harsh dichotomy between the two. They also see a need to combine both individual and collective approaches to these issues. So I talked about systems-oriented approaches where we look at collectives. Their idea is that we need to not only look at the system, but look at the individual nodes within the system too. That perhaps helps us think about animals as absent reference and how we can notice them within the systems without getting lost. So a combination of individual and collective approaches. They also naturally think it's important that we question narratives of endless growth, particularly economic growth. We all know that this is not a realistic portrayal of what we can do as a society. So what's interesting is beyond these rather core or fundamental components of planetary justice, Dreisig and Pickering have left the concept otherwise rather open to interpretation. So what we have tried to do is say, well, how could we evolve this concept through the work that we're doing on societal boundaries and multi-species boundaries? Can we make planetary justice more embodied, more specific, and more workable with these priorities in mind? So that's what we've been working towards. Thank you. We can go forward again. All right, so those are the concepts that we're working with. That's where we position ourselves. And these are some of the ideas that I think it's worthwhile for us to think about over the next couple of days. What I want to do now is talk about some of the themes that we have seen emerge in the literature, which I think will be helpful for us. So we've begun our research by trend spotting, particularly within ecocentric legal scholarly spaces. Or at least spaces that sell themselves as ecocentric. We were looking for approaches that could support a move towards a multi-species kind of approach, and we were also looking for common barriers to movement in that direction. So I hope that this is helpful for thinking in a more non-anthropocentric way for our colloquium here. So we started off by reviewing scholarship from Earth jurisprudence, Earth system law, ecofeminism, planetary justice, and wild law. And this was a fairly organic investigation. It's certainly not comprehensive, and we do have more work to do in this regard. But we identified some pretty interesting trends already just within this relatively limited exploration. And I'd like to talk you through two problematic trends that we identified before introducing 5 perhaps productive ones or helpful ones for us. So the problematic ones are already on the slide here. In looking at all of these various areas of scholarship, scholars who are interested in thinking in more ecocentric ways, we found, and I'm sure you've all noticed this, it's pretty common for a lot of scholars to be saying very similar things. And they're working at the same time, but they're not recognizing each other. Instead of moving forward as a community, we're retreading the same ground, sharing the same ideas. We're interested in trying to, in a more fruitful way, bring this varied work together so that we can, as a broader community, move forward in our work rather than retreading the same ground. So trying to address that disconnect between scholarship in a number of areas. It seems to be repeating itself. A second problematic trend that we noticed, and this is a difficult one, and one that I imagine will be a topic of conversation for us. We see increasingly a trend towards what's quoted on the slide here, overarching, totalitizing, and all-encompassing normative frameworks. So we've all heard various calls for a global treaty on the newest environmental issue. We all need to come together as a global treaty and agree one approach. If we could all just agree to one set of rules, to really doing things in an ambitious way, then things will get better. So we see movement increasingly towards legal and political frameworks that are totalitizing in this way, that subsume diversity across the globe into singular and global approaches. And particularly, we're seeing this in emerging work on Earth system law, just as an example. But as I mentioned in the slide, critical scholars like Marie Catherine Petersman, like Anna Greer, are very critical of this kind of approach. And my colleague Antonio and I are similarly critical. We see an issue with globalizing or totalitizing approaches when they subsume or make invisible the particularities of communities across the globe, particularly and often because they tend to make invisible the more marginal perspectives or marginal approaches. So actors and communities in the global south, or indigenous communities, or queer, feminist, or post-colonial approaches, we find that these often become subsumed within these totalitizing regimes or made invisible within them. So for that reason, we see this as not an unproblematic approach, something that we need to consider quite carefully. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so that's two potential issues that we found that we think bear further thought. We've also found 5 trends that we think could be helpful, that could facilitate working in more multi-species kinds of ways as international environmental law scholars, particularly in the Anthropocene. I think all of these trends orbit around this legal imaginary, this forward-looking idea of a more interconnected, ecocentric, and post-humanist sort of future for law. The first 2 of these themes are shared by areas of scholarship like Earth system law that move towards a totalitizing system. But the last 3 specifically resist that totalitizing approach. So just to make that distinction clear here. Okay, so the first 2 trends that we noticed, which we also see within totalitizing areas of scholarship or totalitizing recommendations within scholarship, such as Earth system law. The first trend is a growing recognition of the significance of networks for environmental governance. And this is something I'm sure we all will have noticed in our own work. It's becoming increasingly common to think by way of networks. And that's particularly common when thinking about symbiosis in environmental governance. How can we work and live closely together in a mutually beneficial kind of way? That seems important for tackling the biodiversity crisis. So we're seeing this crop up across almost all of these areas of scholarship that we reviewed as a direction of travel. Something else that we're seeing, which is maybe not quite as common, is a preference for ways of thinking about the world, ontologies and epistemologies that reject dualisms or binaries and which prefer spectrums. So, as an example, think about the nature and culture dichotomy. We tend to regard ourselves as human beings and human societies as actors within culture, separate from nature. I've already introduced why it's perhaps not productive or accurate to think of ourselves in that way. We are natural beings and natural entities at the end of the day. So we're seeing an increasing move in the scholarship towards thinking in terms of spectrums, rather than having this harsh dichotomy between nature and culture and other dichotomies such as human and non-human, for example, or human and animal. If we were to think in terms of spectrums, we would see a sliding scale between these 2 points. There would be entities, actors, or activities that sit closer to the cultural end of the scale, but still embody elements of nature. So the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. They can exist together. So we see that trend increasingly in the scholarship. Scholars are more and more recognizing spectrum type thinking, which we think is useful. Okay, so the last three. These are ones that specifically resist those totalitizing regimes that I was talking about and problematizing. The first one is the idea of plurality, which we see quite commonly, particularly in studies around indigenous legalities. In any state that is considering reparations for indigenous communities and recognizing indigenous legalities needs to face up to the idea that multiple legal systems or legalities or governance models may exist in the same geographical space, the geographical space that we often think of as the state, for example. So this idea of plurality is increasingly recognized in the literature, not just with regard to law and policy, but also with regard to cosmologies, worldviews, ways that we think about the environment and doing things differently. So clearly this works against that totalitizing approach because we're talking about a potential diversity or multitude of approaches within the same space. In actual fact, plurality is just a very basic, almost boring fact of legal existence. We know that we exist with domestic legislation as well as regional legislation, such as from the EU, as well as international law. All of that exists and operates in a single space, such as the state. So it's really not too novel to be pointing out that there are pluralities of law existing in any one space. What we're trying to do is think about how we can use this reality productively to think about different or more diverse ways of doing things. Two more, and then I'll move on to what I think is the most interesting stuff. So we've also noticed a growing preference for dispersing power amongst various actors and focusing on interconnections between different governing bodies, institutions, and individual actors, as opposed to the totalitizing top-down individual or individualized kind of governance. So we're seeing an increasing preference in the literature for dispersing power in that way. And then lastly, we're also seeing a growing recognition of the kinds of power structures that underpin various legalities and governance models and politics across the globe. So here we're talking about intersectionality theory, the theory that various kinds of oppressions in society, whether they be against women, people of color, queer people, non-human animals, or nature, they intersect in challenging but also interesting and potentially opportunistic ways. They intersect because it is often the same power structures that underlie all of these various and seemingly separate oppressions. So often as an animal law scholar, I'm faced with the argument that we do not have the time or social capital to be able to think about the struggle of animals in society. We simply have too many human rights issues and climate change to be battling with. We don't have the time, we don't have resources. One of the interesting and helpful takeaways from intersectionality theory is that actually, by going to the root of these problems, by thinking about animal justice and multi-species justice in an interconnected way with these other social justice struggles, we can actually move forward much more quickly, much more efficiently, and in a more productive kind of way. We might see more results if we were to recognize these sometimes invisible underlying power structures. So that's the last productive trend that we see, something that scholars are increasingly recognizing and which we think will be helpful in terms of thinking forward to deal with our biodiversity crisis and other environmental crises in the Anthropocene. So we can move forward. Thank you. Okay, so onto the multi-species boundary stuff, which I think is super interesting, but is also perhaps the most conceptually challenging. So bear with me and please feel free to throw up a hand if I haven't explained something that I should. Very happy to be stopped at any time. Okay, so we wanted to explore what direction these 5 productive trends could take us in. How could we use these trends, bring scholarship together, and inch it forwards in a way that adds to planetary justice as a concept? How can we flesh out that concept in more detail in response to these evolutions in the scholarship? Again, I mentioned we wanted to react to how animals are often treated as absent reference within environmental law. For example, and as I've mentioned, this often happens by focusing on our one interconnected Earth system and having that be all that we see, forgetting about the individual actors within it. So in order to justify, so I always feel I need to justify the kinds of approaches or work that I'm doing. In order to justify bringing non-human animal individuals into these conversations, my first question to myself was, well, what precedent already exists for bringing these areas of scholarship together on animal law and environmental law? And you may or may not be familiar with the fact that there has been a long-standing divide between the two areas, even though they are intellectually and also practically quite heavily linked. Over time, that divide has been eroded, and we've seen more and more synergies between the two areas, but tensions still exist. So, first question, what precedent exists for bringing these areas together and using insights from perhaps animal law scholarship to inform how we do things as environmental law scholars? First of all, easy one, we see increasing overlap in the scholarship between discussions regarding the rights of nature and discussions regarding animal rights or non-human animal rights. It's almost peculiar and interesting that these movements have happened almost completely separately from one another. But increasingly with, for example, the work of Angie Pepper on this, we're seeing work on how, for example, non-human animals are experiencing disproportionate struggles in response to climate change. And we're seeing animal rights being put into conversation with rights for nature in areas of scholarship like this. So increasingly, this overlap is being made more present. Second, if we're thinking in terms of approaches to legal questions, critical animal studies and critical animal law studies already recognize and utilize a lot of the productive themes that I identified in the last section. So, for example, it's very common within critical animal law studies to reject boundaries between two dichotomous points, for example. One good example is Megan Glick's work on infrahumanism. She talks about how the human-animal dichotomy is a fiction, how it has always been a socio-political fiction, something that is created and doesn't rely on biology. So she talks about liminality between these two categories. So that use of spectrums is common within this area of scholarship. It's also common to see discussion of plurality, the dispersion of power. Good example of this is in Donaldson and Kimlicka's seminal work called Zoopolis, which you may be familiar with. They recommend essentially giving animals political identity. In some ways, the right to vote, I think, is the kind of the popular tagline for that book, but it says much more than that. So they recognize there the need for plurality and the dispersion of power in dealing with these issues. And we see a lot of recognition of intersectionality, another theme from the previous slide in critical animal law studies. Particularly Black vegan studies and critical race and critical posthumanist studies recognize this intersectionality between various oppressions. So ideologically, these two areas are operating in quite a close or aligned way. So I think it's not a crazy idea to be bringing them together in the way that we were motivated to. Yes, yeah, we can move forward. Okay, so in order to determine how to do things differently in this age of the Anthropocene, we considered bringing in the interests and identifying multi-species boundaries for non-human animals and other non-human actors would require, obviously, broad and diverse participation. This links to conclusions we reached in our work on societal boundaries, which was led by Antonio. So we argue that the process of democratic decision-making regarding how we make our law and policy can't be anthropocentric. It has to be broader than that. And so this creates two priorities for us if we're thinking about taking a multi-species approach. First of all, we think we need to identify what multi-species boundaries non-human actors might choose for themselves. If we were to add to the planetary boundaries framework, we want to go to non-human actors and see what they're communicating to us directly, rather than assume or speak on their behalf. So, to identify those boundaries, from the literature, we suggest applying the idea of deep listening, and I'll talk about that. Second, we think we need to act on those multi-species boundaries that we identify. So non-human animals and other non-human actors have told us what boundaries they might want in some kind of way, not necessarily through speech, but through other forms of communication. They've told us. What do we do with that information? Hopefully something. Our idea here is to rethink agency in law. Rethinking agency could be a way to incorporate results from that deep listening. So in the time I have remaining, I'll talk briefly through these two ideas, these two concepts, how they could work, and perhaps think about whether there's any space for deep listening and rethinking agency in your own work, as we're talking over the next few days. So deep listening, first of all, it's a very simple idea. All this asks is for us to notice in a multi-sensory kind of way. So I refer to deep listening here, but we can think about all of the senses in this regard. Notice what non-human actors are telling us. And there's some really good work in this regard, particularly from feminist ethics of care applied to animal justice. So Josephine Donovan, I really like this quote from her. She says that we should not kill, eat, torture, and exploit animals because they do not want to be so treated. And we know that if we listen, we can hear them. And she sets out this this entire body of work telling us how we can listen and what the result of that might be. So there are more examples here. McKinnon and Donovan give us a very simple idea that if we are looking to the problems that non-human animals in nature face, the solutions that we identify and choose should be their own. They should come from those actors, not from us necessarily. And that requires some very difficult interpretation and collaboration, but we should at least be focused on that end goal. So those feminist ethics of care are a really obvious choice for grounding this deep listening because there's so much work that has been done in that regard. But this is a relatively simple idea. To figure out what boundaries, what multi-species boundaries non-human actors might ask for, we simply listen and look to the ways that they communicate with us. So I'll move on then to agency, which is a little more complex. And this one is more tentative. It's not as clear how this would practically work in the law. So we think we need to listen and notice non-human animals in nature and what they want to tell us about their experience and the boundaries that they would create. We've become really interested in recent work that is reconsidering what agency means. So to be an agent is to act, to exert force on the world around us, to change things, to impact the people and the planet, people around us and the planet and so on. So we're interested in new approaches to looking, or more recent approaches to looking at agency in a less anthropocentric way. It has, since the Enlightenment, been pretty much assumed that agency attaches to human individuals and no others. But in reality, agency can be thought of in a much more nuanced and dispersed kind of way. After all, if we were to take it literally on that description that I just gave, we know that non-human actors also impact the world around them and other actors around them. They exert some kind of force on their environment and other actors in their communities and elsewhere. So Anna Greer is very interested in moving away from individual humanized concepts of agency. She wants to move towards Donna Haraway's concept of sympoiesis, which sounds complex, but all it means is that we are made by coming together. Instead of being individuals who operate within their own separate and protected bubbles, We become ourselves, have a agential force by coming together and making kin with others. We cannot be agents without relations. So it's looking at those webs that connect us and that connect us to non-human animals and the natural environment. So I'm probably running out of time, right? Yes. I have a few ideas about some concepts of more dispersed agency that we could think with. Bruno Latour's concept of the hybrid is one example, which comes from his actor network theory. He talks about doing things in politics and elsewhere in society by acting as hybrids of humans and non-humans. We work together in collaborations. Ask me about that later if you want more details. Let me wrap up there and say, if there's one thing I would like us to take forward into the panel and the rest of the couple of days, it's to work towards helping see non-human nature and non-human animals as more of an absent reference, as really noticing them and responding to that noticing in the work that we do. And I would challenge you all to think about that and how you can do that in all of your work. So thank you so much for listening and really look forward to hearing everyone's presentations.
Thank you very much, Ian. You did it really in time, actually, because we started a bit late.
Okay. Later, right?
We will change because they are coming now. The other, well, I will announce it now. So thank you, Ian. And now I will call to the floor Santiago Rodríguez Sanmiguel, Elena Evangelidis. Sorry if I didn't pronounce it properly. And Asmaa and Robinson will be connected online. And if you don't mind, we will do the Q&A afterwards. So we will invite again Ian to join us to the table, and in order to be, to respect the schedule. Yeah, sure. Yes, I will change just the names. Can you give me a little? Yes, sure. Put these on there. Thank you. First, apparently we had this, but it's not working. That's why I'm sitting here and I'm not giving you. But so sorry. I will try to fix it in the next.
The other presentation. It's not that. Right.
First of all, we welcome to the floor Santiago Rodríguez Sanmiguel. He comes from Universidad Externado de Colombia, and he will talk about the area-based management tools and approach to face marine biodiversity loss in area beyond national jurisdiction. So, Santiago, the floor is yours.
Thank you. As Marouane said, I am Santiago Rodríguez from Universidad Externado de Colombia. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee and the environmental law department of Universidad Externado de Colombia for supporting me. My presentation is area-based management tools and approach to face biodiversity loss in areas beyond national jurisdictions. The structure of the presentation will be divided in three parts. First, I will present, in first place, a diagnosis of biodiversity loss in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Second, And secondly, I will describe these international legal instruments that pretend to face this problematic and the concept of area-based management tools. And finally, I will explain briefly the tension between the global and the regional approach regarding area-based management tools in the negotiation of the biological diversity beyond national jurisdictions treaty. The slogan of this colloquium is "Don't kill the bee." Nevertheless, I would like to encourage you in this presentation to say, let's protect the turtle, let's protect the whale, let's protect the shark. But why? Because oceans are the 7% of our planet, and 2/3 of that 7% are areas beyond national jurisdictions, which is equivalent to the 50% of the planet, namely the half of Earth. Biodiversity in these regions is essential and very important for humanity. This is because, can you put this one? Yes. Because in these areas provide us several ecosystem services, such as climate and temperature regulation, food provision, genetic resources provision, oxygen provision and absorption of carbon dioxide, etc. An example of these areas is, for example, the Costa Rica thermal dome, which serve as a migration corridor for critical endangered species, such as the littleback turtle, which is the one on the screen you can see. But unfortunately, we are facing a crisis regarding biodiversity in these areas based on several anthropogenic activities, such as illegal and reported on unregulated fishing, ship discharge of emissions, hazardous substances and marine litter, laying submarine cables and docks, etc. And if we compare, these activities are connected with the traditional concept of freedom of high seas established in United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, specifically with freedom of navigation, freedom of fishing, and freedom to lay submarine cables and pipelines. This is why we need governance in these areas. And moreover, the same instrument, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, establishes a general obligation to states to protect the marine environment. Nevertheless, this obligation is too general and broad, which is why we need governance. Indeed, just 7% of the ocean has a protected status, and just 1.3 are part of areas beyond national jurisdictions, namely high seas or the area. For this reason, this area shall not be longer a no man's land, and governance is needed. Moving to the second part, the main two instruments that pretend to face this problematic are the Kunming-Montreal post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the Biological Diversity Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement. The first one has a very important target, which is to ensure that by 2030, at least 30% of marine areas are conserved and well managed through systems of effective area-based conservation measures. On the other hand, the BBNJ agreement is one of the first international treaties that pretends to regulate areas-based management tools. And on March of the present year, states reach a consensus on the text of this agreement. Nevertheless, the instrument is not already is not adopted yet. But what are area-based management tools? That's a very important question. Is the same as marine protect areas? Well, the answer is no, because marine protect areas are geographical spaces with the purpose or the main objective to achieve conservation targets, a long-term conservation objective. But area-based management tools, it's a broader concept regarding that these are tools that pretends to regulate specific human activities, that its main purpose may not be the conservation of nature, but other activities. For instance, fishery reserves. Fishery reserves can indirectly protect the environment. Nevertheless, their main purpose is not to protect the environment, but an economical activity, which is fishing. Therefore, there will be a connection and a coordination between marine protected areas and this other mechanism to achieve the objectives stated in the international instrument mentioned. And the third part of this presentation will address the tension between the global and the regional approach on the negotiation of the BBNJ agreement. And the tension could be reflected and summarized in the following question. How states will manage the relationship between BBNJ institutions, which are the institutions of the global treaty, and the regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies? There are three approaches, and I would like to explain briefly in what consists each of them and their advantages and disadvantages. The global approach consists in a centralized and a comprehensive approach where the Conference of the Parties will establish the area-based management tools and aspects such as implementation, monitoring, and review. And in this approach, there will be a hierarchical relationship between the BBNJ institutions and the regional bodies, which is the advantage that it has a broader scope and it will cover more states, consider that it's a global instrument, and in this way it will prevent a regime's fragmentation. However, there is a disadvantage, which is that regional institutions will lose their autonomy. Regarding the regional approach, it provides or it gives priority to the existing institutions and the recognition of the primacy on the regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies. The advantage will be that the adaptation will be easier and the enforcement could be better regarding that there are already institutions and we don't have to start over. And examples of these instruments are, for instance, the OSPAR Convention, the Bucharest Convention, or the Barcelona Convention on this matter. And the disadvantage would be that not all ocean parts has a international legally binding instrument to protect these areas, and not all these instruments are updated or are easily to enforce. Therefore, in this way, there will be a regime fragmentation, which is also a problem. Finally, we got an hybrid approach, which is the combination of both. In this approach, in this perspective, the BBNJ Conference of the Parties will establish the area-based management tools, but they will be implemented in coordination and with complementarity by the regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies. The advantage will be that there will be an equilibrium between both approaches. Nevertheless, some authors think that this model does not change the legal regime, and it's necessary to generate a drastic change on this matter. But finally, what was the approach adopted in the BBNJ Treaty? After several negotiations, there is consensus on the text of the treaty, and the approach adopted is the hybrid one, which in my opinion is the best, considering that it took into consideration factors of both approaches, generating an equilibrium. And we can see that in Article 14 of the text of BBNJ agreement regarding the objectives of these mechanisms. The first objective entails, or it's about the conservation and sustainable use of comprehensive systems of area-based management tools. The word comprehensive is related with the global approach. And in the second objective, which is strengthen cooperation and coordination between BBNJ institutions and the regional bodies. In this way, there is a relationship between with the regional approach. Therefore, there is an equilibrium, and the treaty took the best elements of both approaches. Well, finally, to conclude my presentation, since my time is elapsing, first, it's important to say that biodiversity is not just in land, but indeed a significant variety of living things habits the known other half of the planet. And it's important that states right now has a will to develop international instruments on this matter. Second, there was not lack of consensus regarding the institution of area-based management tools, but the lack of consensus were about how they will be managed. And finally, well, the approach implemented in the BBNJ agreement text is the hybrid one, regarding that the Conference of the Parties will establish these areas, but in coordination with the regional bodies. In sum, do not forget about biodiversity in the other half of the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Santiago, for this amazing presentation. And now I will give the floor to Elena Evangelidis. That's the last presentation, right, Elena?
Yes.
So, Elena comes from the European University Institute in Florence, if I'm correct, right? And she talks today about local and subnational governments in the CBD and beyond. Elena, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, so to introduce the topic of my presentation, I'm talking broadly about local and subnational governments and transnational biodiversity law, which is the topic of my PhD, but to focus in, I'll be talking about experimentalist governance approaches, particularly to the Convention on Biological Diversity. We can do the next slide, thank you. So to start with, I will give a short abstract of what my argument will be about to make it a bit easier to follow. The starting point is that, as we've heard quite a lot, biodiversity globally is on a really steep decline, and this is so despite the fact that at the international level we have a really extreme proliferation of rules in biodiversity law. It's a really dense body of law, it's an old body of law, and so what we have is an implementation gap. And from a legal perspective, I think often the way to think about it is that part of this problem is that there's a very weak degree of legalization. And it's very tempting to think that we need to fix this by making more rules. And the point that I'm making is that perhaps taking an experimentalist governance approach is a way of turning these weaknesses and this degree of flexibility into an asset for biodiversity protection. And I will argue that the Convention on Biological Diversity already is an experimentalist governance system, but that it has a weakness that there could be more focus on the role of local and subnational governments in really operationalizing this approach. So I will conclude by telling a bit about where I think that we are with the view of local and subnational governments in experimentalist governance and how I think it could be potentially improved to make it more effective. Thanks. So yeah, as we have already mentioned, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, there is clearly an implementation deficit. We've seen this with the Aichi targets really gravely, and so now we have the new post-2020 GBF that I think most people are familiar with. And in the run-up to the adoption of the post-2020 GBF, local and subnational governments got really local, and they were saying, hey, we have a really important role in implementing this. It is not just the national parties, but in fact, we are doing most of the implementation work on the ground. And in the European Union, at least 70% of biodiversity legislation are enacted by local governments at that level. And so I'm bringing in the idea of experimentalist governance as a model for managing this type of distribution of power, and in terms of operationalizing and really making real a multi-level governance approach to international biodiversity law. So that's the starting point. Next slide. What is experimentalist governance? So in a nutshell, it proposes a very structured approach to problem solving by local actors, in which local actors need to both explain their choices they are making for experimentation and can also be held accountable for them. So it is not a random way of having experiments here and there. What is experimentalist governance designed to address, or what are the challenges that it can help us overcome? And I think in biodiversity, these are expressed really clearly. So for one, polyarchic distribution of power. We already heard about it in the lecture before. Of course, between the different states, but in biodiversity specifically, because of the spatial component that it has, that it spans from the local level to the very global level, there is a distribution of power where even within states, there can be very many shared competences depending on where we are. So of course, local actors need to be on board if you want to implement it effectively. Secondly, strategic uncertainty. This means that normally actors don't know going forward how they can solve this problem. And in biodiversity, we know that because we have a lot of scientific uncertainty. So this means that actors are more open to fixing problems by engaging together in experimentalist problem solving and finding new solutions that they might not be familiar with. And the idea is that applying experimentalist governance can then yield normative benefits, which are mostly centered around democratic decision-making and joint deliberation, which will then produce fairer and better results. So as I already said, experimentalist governance is not about placing random experiments here and there, but in fact, to have an experimentalist governance regime at any level, and it can exist anywhere. It can be in one treaty, it can be in a governance complex. There are certain criteria that need to be met, and for that I identified 4 that are normally mentioned in the literature. And what I'm arguing is that these already exist in the CBD, so I will kind of plow through how they exist there because most are familiar with the convention. But that also there is a way that already we can see that they are applying specifically to local and subnational governments in that context. So to start with, you need to have a broadly agreed common problem, the biodiversity crisis, and a framework understanding with open-ended goals. That is the convention itself, but the goals are also, for example, in the post-2020 framework, explicitly called goals with indicators that are then to be implemented by lower-level actors. So normally these lower-level actors are the parties to the convention, they are the states, the state parties. Although in the context of the CBD, actually, there is more recognition than in other conventions about the role that local actors have to play in it. Because, in fact, there is an action plan that recognizes how important local and subnational governments are to it, and this is the only of the Rio Convention that has a mechanism to this kind. That then also, in turn, and this is the third point, opens the convention to participation by local and subnational governments through this recognition that they get in the convention. So in the run-up to the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, there was an organized process which was called the Edinburgh process. It was initiated by the Secretariat, but then actually taken over and managed by the Scottish Government, which focused on collecting the views of local and subnational governments on what should be included in the post-2020 GBF. And they came out with a document which summarized their priority areas, and in fact also then managed to have an inclusion in the text of the new framework that there should be a whole of government approach. It's recognized in several points to implementing the convention. And in addition to that, local governments and specifically cities have their own advisory committee under the convention, and so do subnational governments. So they are able to sit in negotiations, they are able to go to the SBI meetings, and so on. So they have a pretty active voice. And then number 4, and I think this is what really distinguishes experimentalist governance from other types of new governance arrangements, is the fact that for all these goals, you need to have a system for revising these goals on a basis for taking stock of what's working, what's not working. And then sometimes there can be a penalty default. So under the CBD, we don't have a penalty default, and it's also not a requirement. But what we do have is a system for monitoring the implementation, and this works mainly through the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, where of course there are reporting requirements attached to it, and this is how we have kind of a running system of how well the convention is working. In relation to local governments, we actually have institutionalized under the CBD also the idea of local biodiversity and strategy and action plans, as well as subnational biodiversity strategy and action plans. And although this is not mandatory, I have found that this is something that in some countries has become very common, specifically Japan, specifically North American countries, and the UK. And this is a way that we can monitor how well biodiversity conservation is working at a more localized level than just the national. However, what I do think is that to really have a fully operational experimentalist governance regime, what is missing is a more strategic way to think about how these local plans are developed and how well they are being implemented at the various local levels. Thank you. So I wanted to take some stock of where we are in terms of the specific requirement, or how we could operationalize this better to really have a functioning experimentalist governance system that includes local governments. So for one, there was discussion of including indicators for local and subnational governments in the post-2020 monitoring framework. We don't have them yet, but there is a provision that says they may be supplemented by subnational criteria. So I think this is something that I want to continue highlighting, that it would be great to have them because it would allow us to take more stock and a more disaggregated way of seeing how well the convention is operating. And then secondly, and this is where we're going a little bit outside of the CBD framework, there are networks that are being really active on subnational and local action, specifically ICLE, that I think a lot of people are familiar with. This is a network of cities, and they have a cities biodiversity center. And they have organized the signature of pledges. So in December, we had the Montreal pledge because there was a summit where all the local governments got together and they pledged what their commitments should be. And going forward, we will have an urban nature pledge that will be called the Berlin Urban Nature Pact. And all of these pledges are tied to the CBD. And they are also integrated with an online platform that is called, we have Cities with Nature and Regions with Nature, where the progress on them can be uploaded and monitored. So this is an emerging form of peer review that is not completely functional yet in the way that we would like to see it, but where I think it is nascent that actually local and subnational governments are taking initiative to do it themselves. And with that, we also have various indices. I put up the Singapore index, but there are a few indices that are starting to give an idea of how we can, monitor this in the urban and at the local level. So my takeaways for the presentation is that the CBD is a very fertile ground for having an experimentalist governance regime, but that there is a lot of potential for further integrating local and subnational governments and making them very visible in this process. And I would say the main key factors here would be to improve monitoring and peer review for local governments, and this could be either institutionalized through the CBD or it could be done independently through networks. And then the last factor we didn't talk about much, but of course this all needs funding, and there is a program for giving funding directly to local actors through the Global Environment Facility actually, but this would probably have to be increased quite significantly if we want local governments to be able to take very ambitious action. Yes, that would be the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, for your wonderful presentation. And we're running out of time a bit, so I'll just invite the next speaker, who is Asmaa Khadim from Leiden University. She's connected through Teams. I guess we can see you. Yes. Hi, Asmaa. And she talks about resisting Midas Curse, a constitutional ethnography of environmental rights in Costa Rica. The floor is yours, Asmaa. If you want to share the presentation, feel free to do it.
Hello, sorry. I hear a bit of an echo.
I will stop now my microphone, but maybe your phone is close to your laptop because we can hear some.
Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of trouble uploading the slides. Let's see if that works. There we go. Can everyone hear me and see the slides?
Everything is perfect, Asmaa.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks very much to the organizers, first of all, for accommodating this online. I wish I could have been there in person, but it's nice to still be a part of it. Sort of just building on some of the things that my colleagues have been talking about today, I'm looking sort of more from a domestic perspective at what kind of strategies are available for local communities in terms of biodiversity protection. And so what I'm presenting today is really very much a work in progress. It's in the early stages of research. The ideas are still being developed. And the title of the project is Resisting Midas Curse, Environmental Rights in Costa Rica. So what's the connection to Midas? Well, to start with, we're talking about gold mining, so it seems appropriate. And according to Aristotle, legend held that Midas died of starvation because he wanted unlimited quantities of gold. So the Midas curse actually reminds us to consider the consequences of pursuing mineral wealth at the expense of everything else. And nowhere is that more apparent than within the context of mining, where developers are literally engaged in the pursuit of gold or other valuable commodities. Yet we also need these minerals for technological development, in fossil fuel transitions, and for a lot of the for the human way of life in the current age. So extraction isn't really something that's going to go away, and what we need to know is how to strike a balance between development and conservation. How do we resolve these normative questions about what's worth saving and when should we just walk away from a lucrative project? So those are the questions that are at the heart of socio-environmental conflicts around mining and resource development. Just to give you a sense of what's at stake with large mining projects, on the one hand, you have economic growth, job creation, energy security. On the other hand, you have all of the consequences we always hear about: pollution, biodiversity loss, water impacts, and other human health impacts, human rights violations. So where these impacts are not adequately mitigated, or where the cost to public stakeholders is too high, for example, where there's a permanent loss of cultural heritage or biodiversity, these projects can become a deep source of conflict and controversy. And my research looks at environmental rights, and in particular constitutional environmental rights, and how they can offer solutions for local communities. So in seeking to have other important values recognized, rather than simply focusing on economic benefits, communities are increasingly turning to the courts for a resolution, and in many cases they rely on constitutional environmental rights as the basis for their claims. Environmental rights have formed the basis for successful court challenges by many communities around the world, and so where the right to a healthy environment is constitutionally guaranteed, public stakeholders can try to assert a healthful environment as a priority, however that term might be interpreted. And so this has become an increasing trend, as we'll see in the case of the Las Crucitas gold mine in Costa Rica. But before we get to that, just a quick word on what we mean by constitutional environmental rights. It's important to note that environmental rights are not the same as environmental laws, though they are related. So environmental law is more of a collective term describing regulation of the effects of human activity on the environment, So that's the kind of regulation that addresses things like pollution or forests or fishery management. Whereas environmental rights are, generally speaking, capturing the environmental dimension of human rights. So we're essentially talking about a substantive right to a healthy and ecologically sound environment. And that includes procedural protections to support the substantive aims, like participatory rights, rights to information, the right to free and meaningful participation in planning and decision-making. Environmental rights can also include aspects that emphasize responsibility on the part of both individuals and governments to protect and preserve the environment. So in terms of how well recognized these rights are, some countries have them, some do not. Most of Latin America has constitutionally recognized these rights, but you won't find them in places like Canada or the US or Australia. And as you can see from the map, many countries around the world have taken steps to protect environmental rights through entrenchment within their national constitutions, based on the idea that environmental rights should be included within national constitutions in the same way as other rights. So the light green countries are those with some type of constitutional provision for a healthy environment, whereas the dark green areas are countries that specifically have a constitutionally protected human right to a healthy environment. So I'm looking at this from sort of a completely different perspective from our keynote speaker. This is a very anthropocentric approach, but one that I think is still valuable. So a right implemented through a national constitution is considered to have more force because it's the supreme law of the land. And so all legislation and regulations passed has to comply with constitutional requirements. But of course, there are other factors that are relevant as well. Is the judiciary willing to enforce these provisions? What's the constitutional culture? Are these provisions aspirational, or are they something more? Are there rule of law issues? So just because those rights are entrenched doesn't necessarily mean that we'll see the benefits. There are some tangible benefits of constitutionally entrenching environmental rights. They've been linked to better court decisions, stronger environmental protection laws. There have been some studies also showing improved environmental performance in places that have constitutional environmental rights. These rights are said to increase access to justice and make government decision makers more transparent, deliberative, and accountable. And generally, we're talking about trying to address power imbalances, particularly where you have multinational mining companies with deep pockets developing projects in areas where you also have perhaps marginalized communities. So this brings me to the Costa Rican example that I'm looking at. So Lawscapes is a project that was owned by a company called Infinito, which was a Costa Rican subsidiary of a Canadian company. And its estimated value was about US $1 billion for this gold deposit if it was developed fully. But the decision to grant mineral exploration and exploitation permits faced a lot of opposition due to the risk of environmental harm and the perceived lack of benefit to local communities. The environmental concerns included destruction of tropical forests that are home to endangered species. The deposit lies within the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. It's one of the country's largest hotspots. It's a fragile ecosystem. There was a serious risk of air, soil, and water pollution and risk of harm from toxic mercury and cyanide solutions. And so there was a lot of public concern around this project. There was a 2008 presidential decree that authorized the removal of 600 acres of yellow almond trees that provided a habitat and food source for the endangered green macaw. So that permit would have then allowed the deforestation of a certain area and for the company to develop the gold mine. And as a result of public pressure and a number of legal challenges by environmental groups and activists, the mining permits were ultimately cancelled in 2012. And I find this example to be particularly interesting because there's so much financial interest at stake here, and yet the mining did not go ahead. So I was curious about, how this happened, and was there something unique about the Costa Rican context? And when we look at the legal history relating to the project's development, we can see that the Costa Rican Supreme Court seems to have taken an inconsistent approach at times, but also that its reasoning is centered on a discussion of Article 50 of the Costa Rican Constitution, which basically provides that all persons have the right to a healthy and ecologically balanced environment, and also places a responsibility on the state to preserve this right. So the case itself had a very convoluted history. Initially, the exploration permits are granted, and then there are some legal challenges along the way, some injunctions, and then in 2004, the Constitutional Court ruled that the right to healthy environment was violated by the permit because it was granted prior to the approval of an environmental impact assessment. So they didn't say that the mine and the deforestation itself would be a violation of Article 50, but just that an environmental impact assessment was needed. So then the next year, the EIA is submitted, the government approves it, permits are issued, and the clearing of trees begins. And then, there were more injunctions, temporary injunctions sought, and eventually the Constitutional Court finds that there is no violation to a right to the environmental rights, because there was a properly obtained environmental impact assessment. So interesting things happen after this. The litigants, concerned communities, ended up filing a different application with with an administrative tribunal, actually challenging some of the permits specifically. And those permits allowed for specific trees to be destroyed, and the administrative court actually ruled that destruction of that area was contrary to Article 50. So subsequent to that, the Constitutional Court later dismisses a challenge by the mining company and sort of comes on side. But I think what we see in these cases is that they can be very, very complicated, very convoluted. It's not as simple as you have a provision that's being interpreted and then the courts will just have a straightforward application. Of course, there are a lot of other factors. But one of the things that Las Crucitas highlights for me is that there's this tension between various institutions. So the judges of the administrative courts were more willing to recognize and enforce environmental rights in this instance, as compared to the Constitutional Court, who were less expansive in their interpretations and didn't really take action to dismiss Infinito's challenge unless it was less politically risky for them to do that. So rather than focus on broader questions of whether mining should actually take place, the administrative tribunal used its very narrow authority to make a pretty narrow ruling that the forest permits violated the right to a healthy environment. But that effectively stopped mining in the area. So this raises some questions. What does this tell us about the role of constitutional environmental rights for institutions, for the executive, for the legislatures? We see that there's been various presidential moratoria declaring a ban on open pit mining along the way. There's amendments to the legislative, the mining code, to be more protective. So there's questions around to what extent constitutional provisions influence these actors, and is it a combination of law and public pressure at play? And for the courts, this is also an interesting area of research to see what led to these inconsistent decisions. Was it a difference in interpretation? Was it that the judiciary was not so independent? And I learned in my research that the administrative tribunal was comprised of 3 people. They were young, they were committed, they were independent, and they wanted to show that they had the power to make change and didn't owe anyone anything. But as a result of this decision, they did suffer, and only one is still in the position, the others were moved. So I think it's interesting to see that that constitutional environmental rights can be a tool that's used by the judiciary if it's sufficiently motivated. And it can offer mechanisms and avenues for public stakeholders to take their grievances before various institutional authorities. And in a functioning constitutional order, this ought to provide some remedies, some kind of a forum for concerns about issues like biodiversity protection to be heard. And this might be where constitutional environmental rights offer tangible benefits. And although constitutional environmental rights as they're currently framed may be seen as anthropocentric, they can still offer a strong protection for ecosystems when they're implemented correctly. So that's, I'm not sure if I've gone over time. That's it. So I'll be happy to take questions during the Q&A period.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Asmaa. I couldn't. I had my microphone muted. Thank you very much for your amazing presentation. I'll go directly to the next speaker, which is Robinson Miranda from the Universidad Católica dos Santos. And Robinson, can you hear us?
Hi.
Robinson, can you hear us now?
Good morning.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, hi. Hi, good morning, everyone. I know use slide. I'm only speak. Okay.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Well, just to present you your paper, the paper of Robinson Miranda is entitled Warning Sign, the Biodiversity Crisis and Non-Compliance with the H's Goal in Latin America. The floor is yours, Robinson. I don't know if you can share the camera or... Can you hear me?
As I'm problem a camera.
Let me see if I can do it. No. Well, feel free to start wherever you want. The floor is yours, Robinson.
Okay. Here we have 5 hours of time zone difference. I'm speak from Brazil, São Paulo. Today it's raining, so maybe I have some instability in the system around here. But I'm already planned to be present next year in Tarragona. I want to first greet everyone and thank you for opportunity to be able to talking about research in development. I appreciate it to the Tarragona Center for Environmental Law students and Tarragona Environmental Law Students Association and the organization of the colloquium by Faculty of Legal Science, Department of Public Law, and the Universitat Rovira and Virgili. I am Robinson. I am PhD candidate in international environmental law and at the Catholic University of Santos. And my central research topic concerns the process of ocean governance, but specifically related to the recent approval of the BBNG agreement on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity of areas by national jurisdiction. I'm also a professor of environmental law and at the Municipal University of São Caetano do Sul. And I'm sorry, but I can't stay for the morning debates because I have class soon. If there are any questions, you can see me by mail, please, which I'm answering. And since the research topic also involves biodiversity, but is specifically the loss of biodiversity, made a proposal to bring a brief reflection on challenges of implementing the AAEDAT goals. Research has been developing in order to assess the difficulties of implementing the AAEDAT targets during the decade of biodiversity, and as we are now in the decade of the oceans, the topic of biodiversity loss is also important in the international debate. We then began with a mapping of Latin America and Caribbean to establish the geographic location of the student, with the exception of the country as it is a French overseas territory, for example, French Guiana, also Suriname, Belize, due to colonization too. Having made these considerations, we look at issue of biodiversity itself, genetic diversity, specific diversity, ecosystem diversity, especially regional difference, to identify some of the main factors that lead to biodiversity loss, such as pollution, habitat destruction, climate change. Our student will seek to highlight the main international documents related to the theme of biodiversity, taking as a starting point the Convention on Biological Diversity, signed in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, followed by two important protocols, Cartagena and Nagoya, until we reach the aspirational goals of AAEDAT, its 5 strategies and 20 targets for the period considered as the decade of the biodiversity. For example, strategic objective A, address the root causes of biodiversity loss by making biodiversity concerns permeate government and society. Strategic objective B, reduce direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use. Strategic objective C, improving the biodiversity situation by protection, ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. Strategic objective D, increasing the benefits of biodiversity and ecosystem service for all. And strategy objective E, increase implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. And concluding, we move on the preliminary conclusions of a study. One, the loss of biodiversity implies reflections on human life on Earth. Two, the need for a look at human rights and the understand of the intersection between the right to nature and the right to an ecologically balanced environment, a fundamental postulate, so that we can also think about the rights of future generations. Number three, attention needs to be paid to the global agreements on access to environmental information, such as the Aarhus Convention, and at the regional level, the Escazú Agreement. Number four, use of regional environmental governance mechanisms with the expanded participation of multiple international, state-owned, no-state actors. And finally, number five, there are still many challenges related to transformative education and the affirmation of regional governance for the biodiversity. It's okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Robinson, for being perfectly on time. And now I invite Professor Offor to join us in the table and start the Q&A part of the panel. So I invite the audience to react on what they have listened in today's morning. So our colleague Francesca will give you the microphone in order to be audible as well to the online participants. So, Francesca.
Hi, thank you all for the wonderful presentation. It was great to listen to, and yeah, I enjoyed my morning. I have a question for the keynote speaker, because I was fascinated by your critique of this totalitizing, if I can call it that, and I must admit that perhaps I needed a bit more context, because I can also see that essentially it's a critique of the top down, of imposing from this higher framework to the regional or even the local level. And I could see that this is flipped by some people who may not agree with certain environmental laws, such as the nature restoration regulation that's currently heavily debated within the European Parliament, to say, well, why do we need this European answer? Because so there's a potentially another side to that argument. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that. Is there always a harm in totalitizing? Because, for example, at the European level, I would be quite happy if the nature restoration law was adopted, although it looks less and less likely every day. And then I was also very intrigued by how we listen to different species. I thought that was fascinating because, I mean, it sounds engaging, but perhaps I need another example because, for example, with UV light, that's something we can't see as humans, but a lot of species use this to communicate. So immediately I start thinking, well, which senses are we going to use when we're limited to just, I think, 5 from the top of my head, and a lot of species have much more. So this listening becomes a bit complicated, but maybe using science, there's a way to engage in that more constructively. So these were my 2 questions for you, and then I'll pass the floor to another.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I think 2 really interesting, challenging questions. I think on the first one, there's certainly merit to doing things at an international collaborative level, right? And I think the critique of solely totalitizing approaches for me speaks more to the way that we're working at that international or in that global sphere. I think when coming together in those ways, the priority is about deep and meaningful participation at all moments. So in deciding who is coming together in the room and having people in the room and in actions afterwards. So I think in those larger spaces, it is possible to use them and do them well as long as there is that meaningful participation. And I think not just participation of bodies and people in different groups, but also of ideas. So genuinely different ways of doing things, particularly decolonial type approaches to these issues. But I think the pushback against totalitizing regimes has always more so been about recognizing and responding to local actors and their needs, as well as looking at the interface, as some of the other presentations were talking about, between local, regional, and international actors. So really, this is just a word of caution against rushing straight to a global top-down approach as our only approach and as a sort of hard law approach. So I think I see space for nuance there, and I guess is the short answer. On the second question about listening or noticing, there's one really interesting perspective that I've read about this that I like, which is there's often a response to this idea of noticing non-human animals in nature and incorporating that into our legal processes, saying, well, it's impossible. How on earth do we do that? How do we do that well in a way that doesn't just look like ventriloquism, where we are in the end just speaking for non-human animals? Some of the responses I've seen have said, well, when you think about it, the way that we interpret the boundaries and the needs of different human societies, of the way economies work, for example, that's all educated guesswork as well in the end. It's very difficult to anticipate and diagnose those needs and boundaries in a meaningful way. So in theory, it's not that big of a jump to be doing this for multi-species approaches as well. So I think you're right. So within feminist care theory, traditionally the approach has been listening, so auditory, I suppose, but increasingly there is this focus on all 5 senses, so a deeper noticing. But you're right, that's something I haven't thought about, to think about, different forms of communication that we simply don't have access to and how that could be incorporated. The short answer is I don't know, but I think that we should. And I suppose there's a lot to be said here for how law and science interact, how we bring the two together. So yeah, I don't know, but I'd be happy to talk about it further. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all the panelists for their interesting presentations. I have a question, very quick one for Iyan, that continues with this reflection about the idea of listening to animals, to other species. So regarding that, I was wondering, according to your framework or the model you presented, how can you address like competing interests between different species or groups of animals? And I was thinking particularly on the case of pets and wildlife, thinking on the cases of, for instance, Australia or New Zealand, where one of the main drivers of extinction of birds, for instance, is cats, so how can you strike a balance between this interest in this particular case? I was curious to know about. Thank you.
Yeah, that's another really good question. So I think some of the literature speaks to this, speaks to noticing what animals' interests are and responding to them. And I think generally the response is, well, there tends to be a panic when we start talking about incorporating non-human animals or nature, thinking, oh God, this means we have to change everything, change it abruptly and change it radically. But that doesn't have to be the way, because when we notice and react to human interests and human boundaries, we don't necessarily change everything straight away to respond to those desires in all cases, but we look at that full picture, right? And I think that maybe speaks to that combination of collective and individual approaches that planetary justice speaks to. I think it's still a radical first step just to do the work to identify what those multi-species boundaries would be. So doing that and actually speaking about them in the right rooms would already be a step forward. The action we take as a result of that, it doesn't have to mean prioritizing them above all else in all instances. It would mean putting it into conversation with all of these other societal interests we're already talking about, but crucially recognizing that they are significant, they're worth paying attention to and reacting to. So again, no easy answer, but I suppose, yeah, the rights of cats to hunt endangered species, it's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you everybody for your very stimulating comments and presentations. I guess this is a question sort of for, is it Elena? I was trying to sort of reconcile your comments about the SNLGs. Do I have that right? And then Ian's comments about these sort of these totalizing or overarching frameworks, and how you saw your comments interfacing, because it seems like the CBD at one level is the kind of framework that has the potential to have broad impacts, but then isn't always brought about that regularly, and then it's almost most effective at the more local level. That could seem to me to be both very exciting in some respects, but also create regulatory gaps or conflicts between these areas. So I guess I wanted to see how the two of you would negotiate your sort of differing areas of expertise there. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, so I also thought about this in relation to the idea of having kind of totalitarian. Yes, okay. And the way I see it, they are actually not in tension at all, because I think that, for example, specifically experimentalist governance is a good way to respond to that. It's kind of the idea of saying, okay, we come together on a common idea, but actually how you manage that is really up to you. And also in terms of, I think it's necessary also in terms of knowledge generation. I mean, every place will need something else, not just based on culture, but also based on what you have there. So yeah, I didn't personally see them in conflict. I saw them as quite complementary, but I don't know if that is also your view.
Yeah, likewise. I also saw, I think I saw the work that you spoke to as being a good example of how this can work in practice. I think, yeah, framework rules or systems at the international level can be a useful thing as long as there is meaningful implementation at the local and regional level, and then discussion between those levels, right? Yeah, that's something particularly in the area of animal law, where there's no relevant treaty. There's been lots of treaty drafting being done by scholars in the area that usually neglects that sort of trans-level discussion. So I also saw them as working quite well together, these ideas. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
If I could just ask a follow-up. So one of the things that occurs to me is how in the United States it's been so difficult to have any kind of national climate change policies. And so what we've seen is effectiveness on these local levels. Now that's great in many respects, but it also sometimes leaves politicians at the higher levels, sort of lets them off the hook, because they say, well, it just works at the local level, so we don't need these broader frameworks. So I guess I was wondering whether or not that does become problematic if the local levels work so well that people decide to just stop with the overarching because of the politics involved.
I think it's a good question. I think, well, the US and the CBD, that's kind of its own bucket, but I I mean, I think if you have it in terms of a framework exchange, then that's always, I don't think it's about letting the national level out. I think local government and subnational government, multi-level governance is specifically about strengthening that link and kind of thinking about who can be doing what, and it's just about disaggregating further and further. And there was a moment in kind of international law literature where it was like, okay, subnational and local governments, this is all about discarding the sovereign state. For me, it's not about that. It's more about making clear at each level what you can be doing. But yeah, I would agree with you that if it was just about the local governments, it might make a regulatory gap. But I think in the US as well with biodiversity, there is quite a lot of local action that is seeking to fill that gap by the fact that the US is not in the convention, specifically California, kind of mirroring what happened with climate. But yeah, that will be my take on it.
I think all I would add really is that I haven't given much thought to what we do when something is working so well that it lets someone off the hook. I feel like we're perhaps very far away from that point. But it's a really interesting thought, and I think, yeah, I would agree entirely. It's about maintaining workable multi-level governance, meaning that no one is essentially off the hook, but everyone has a role to play, and it's about how those interfaces work in practice, I suppose.
There are two more questions, but with these two questions we'll finish because we are running out of time. Okay,
thanks a lot to all the speakers for your brilliant presentation. I would like to go back to the first question that was asked to Iyan, and in particular, how is it possible to give a voice to animals and non-human species, and whether you thought about possible proceduralization of this very difficult task, and whether in your view there are already legal tools that can be used to incorporate these non-human views into legal, so lawmaking processes, for instance, impact assessments or others. And then I have a question also for Elena. I find your research very interesting, and the approach you use is similar to a project, a research project I led together with Francesca Rosignoli, where we try to understand how climate change is integrated in subnational policies and what are the factors that influence this integration. And I'm wondering whether, in addition to a role for subnational and local governments in implementation, you are also exploring the role in agenda setting of these actors at the level of the CPD. Thanks a lot.
Well, I'll take the question directed to me first. I think in short, the short answer would be no. I don't know that there is a model that is existing and functioning right now that implements the kind of deep participation that I envisage for multi-species collaborations. I think impact assessments is an interesting idea. I think the issue there would be that if we were simply to incorporate the impact on non-human animals and also nature into impact assessments, that turns non-human animals and nature, broadly speaking, into a passive sort of thing where things happen to them. There's an impact upon them, rather than actively engaging them as speakers, I suppose. I mean, there may be a way to update how impact assessments are done to incorporate that. The other thought that I had was maybe the closest we've gotten is the idea of guardians and using that as a way to implement rights for nature. But still, guardians kind of presupposes that there is a human being who will speak for or on behalf of nature or a non-human animal. So again, I'm looking to something that is potentially more radical, where there is a way for those non-human entities to speak for themselves within our processes. But perhaps there's more investigation I can do, and there is a model out there that I just haven't read about yet. That's entirely possible.
Thank you so much for your question. That's really interesting to hear that you research, and that I will love to speak about it more later, but I will try to answer in a structured way because it's a part that, yes, I'm exploring, but it's still very much ahead of me. But my impression so far is that yeah, in the local government and subnational context, there are various centers of who is doing the agenda setting, and ICLE is very instrumental, but then Regions 4 more for the regions. It's kind of strange that I think cities and subnational governments have come together in that way, and I've always perceived a bit of tension in the CBD around, is it about urban biodiversity, is it about multi-level governance, and then it all kind of fused into one. But yeah, so it is something I'm looking at, and I think it's interesting how we can definitely see different centers emerging for this agenda setting that might come from different geographical regions as well. So yeah, I hope that answers. But just
Hi. Well, thank you all, the panelists, for such a wonderful presentations. I have another question for Dr. Offor. Sorry, we are giving you a lot of work today, but that's only because it was a wonderful one. I wanted to ask you about a recent event related to how non-human animals speaks to us, and which may sound funny or silly, but I think it's an actual good example of listening to non-human animals. I don't know if you have heard about orca Gladys. No, it's a recent situation, event happening in Gibraltar in South Peninsula Iberica, where an orca was accidentally hit by a ship. And now apparently she's leading a group of other orcas who are chasing down other ships. So that's a good example of what they're telling us, like, hey, keep your distance, right? So the question is how to implement or how to build the boundaries they need. For example, indeed, in that case, from a legal perspective. Thank you.
I like the story. It's a good one. And I think so much of the really valuable literature that talks about how animals are communicating to us uses anecdotes like this. We're looking for these sites and moments of resistance to human activity and how it works. Of course, in tandem with that, we have animal welfare science that shows us how animals' minds and bodies work and how things impact them. So, for example, we know that sentience is a quality that many more animals than we used to think have. And the issue with that kind of science being that it requires experimentation, often painful and permanently impactful experimentation to determine whether animals are sentient in that way. So there may be a case for operating with an approach that doesn't require that hard evidence, I suppose. But so your question was about how we actually implement that, legally speaking, right? I suppose I still don't know. I think we are still at the place of arguing, defending the idea that this is a valuable exercise and that this should happen. I think in terms of considerations to bear in mind as we incorporate this into our governance models and lawmaking processes, I think putting these ideas into conversation with existing interests and having meaningful value and representation of these multi-species interests as well. We of course have to translate this into language that we can understand. So translating these anecdotes, these other ways that animals communicate that we can't process, translate them into something meaningful for us who are at the end of the day writing down the laws and enforcing the laws. Yeah, this requires further thought and further research, and I think that's part of what I want to do through exploring this idea of hybrids through Latour's actor network theory, which talks about placing agency in the connections between different actors, human and non-human, and that could mean having multi-species collaborations that work to create our laws. So having those multi-species dialogues, listening, noticing in different ways as part of the lawmaking process. So that obviously sounds pretty radical, and how practically we get there, I'm not sure yet. But I think there's lots of interesting options in the literature I just haven't looked at yet. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists, for your amazing presentation, and the audience for their for being here at that time. But the coffee is waiting for us. But just three things. First of all, we have 3 amazing posters that will be presenting during the breaks these couple of days, and those posters are Simona Fanning's poster, Yona McCanty's poster, and Susan Hotkova posters, and you will be able to listen to their presentations during the coffee break. So I invite you to go and ask and have a quick talk and discuss with them about their presentations. The coffee break will take place above us in a room that you have just to go upstairs, and you will look. You will see the TIEC signals, and so. And that's everything. Thank you very much, and see you in the coffee break.